Hi, everybody. So we are going to be having our first lesson on evolution. So what's going to happen is you're going to watch this video. You can take notes on top of the notes that I've given you. As you can see, this should look pretty familiar. This is pages 23 and 24 in your Regents Review packet. If you don't have your Regents Review packet, I did also provide it within Edmodo. So if you can't find it, you can always print this out for yourself. Okay, so in addition to this PowerPoint, I'm going to provide two links to a PBS Learning Media Evolving Ideas. One of the videos is Who is Charles Darwin? And the other video is How Does Evolution Really Work? So I will be posting that as links on Edmodo, and I really encourage you to watch them. They're like 6 or 7 minutes long, the video, but I think they're going to really solidify everything that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so the definition of evolution is a change in species over time. So we all know that things evolve. So what does that really mean? So when we think about, the woolly mammoth, something that has been extinct for a long period of time, you can kind of see how the woolly mammoth is very closely related to the elephant, that they have very similar characteristics with the elephant, that they have similar body structures, and somehow along the way, the woolly mammoth died out and became extinct while the elephant still lives today. So we're gonna get into that a little bit today. So evolution is a change in a species over time. And the first person to really come up with this idea is Charles Darwin. So as you can see here, it says Darwin noticed the following when he studied in the Galapagos Islands. So Charles Darwin came from England, and he sailed on a ship called the Beagle to an area by South America, which are known as the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are very interesting. There are thousands of little islands all over the place in the Galapagos Islands. So what he did notice was he noticed that we had all these different types of finches that were on these different islands, finches being birds. So he really studied birds on these islands, and he noticed that there were thousands of different kinds of birds. They had different coloring, they had different beaks. Some beaks were used to crack open seeds, some beaks were used to get into the nectar of flowers. Some were used to cut open pieces of fruit for themselves. So these beaks had all these different, I want to say, like, let's call these tools, okay? They had all these different reasons that the beak was used for, but yet they all came from what's going to be known as a common ancestor, meaning that they all kind of arrived from one organism. So he was wondering, how on earth did they come into all these different thousands of different kinds of species of fish? So he came up with this idea of natural selection. And above natural selection, I want you to put nature chooses, because that's what's happening in natural selection. Nature is choosing who is going to live and who is going to die. So how does nature choose? Very simple. It's called survival of the fittest. And when we think fit, we're like, oh, somebody's fit, they work out, they take care of themselves. Yes, that's one definition of fit. But when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about who's got the best traits for the environment. For example, if you take a polar bear, right, and you look at a polar bear and you see them in their environment in the Arctic, let's say, okay, they have thick skin, a lot of blubber, they're white in color to camouflage in the snow. The extremities of their bodies tend to be darker in color in order to keep those areas warm. So all of these characteristics are things that have made the polar bear very successful in that environment. If I were to take that polar bear and drop them in the middle of a rainforest, would that be successful for the environment? Probably not so much, right? Because what's going to happen is the polar bear is going to have things that it doesn't necessarily need. It's not going to need that thick layer. It's not going to need that thick fur. You know, yes, I know polar bears eat fish. I mean, we can drop them in an area where there is, you know, water, where there's fish in the water, and that's the way that they can survive. But, you know, it's just their traits are not good for the environment. So whenever you are looking at questions related to evolution, you really got to bring it back to the environment. Are the traits good for that environment? Okay. So we've heard of the term variations. We talked about that during sexual reproduction, right? So during crossing over and meiosis, we have this variation between the sex cells, meaning that each of the egg cells that are produced have a different set of information. Each of the sperm cells that are produced have a different set of information. And then when they come together, then they create a different organism. So we've always had a negative connotation with the mutation, like, oh, mutation, change in the DNA is a bad thing. Well, not necessarily, okay? Because if the change is a good change, it actually causes them to survive and reproduce. And ultimately, that is the goal of all organisms in this world, to survive and reproduce. Because if you don't survive and reproduce, when you die, your DNA and what's written in your DNA dies too. See, most of the animals in the animal kingdom are not, there's not one male to one female and they live together like a family like we do as humans. Most organisms are like one male to several females, because they, in evolution's mind, that male is trying to basically give his genetic information to all these females so that he can possibly get more offspring, and his, superior DNA is what is going on to his offspring. Same thing for the females. So, you got to kind of take humans out of this. I want you to think about this in terms of the animal kingdom. Okay? So if there was a good change in the DNA, maybe, for example, let's bring it back to this whole COVID situation. There are some people who are exposed to it and show no signs. They don't get sick. They don't feel sick. They're fine. They're nothing wrong, right? So there's a mutation maybe in their DNA, or maybe there's something going on within their body, that there is a slight difference, which is causing them to not be affected by the virus. So that would be a good change, okay? So to kind of relate it to what's going on in the world right now. Next, we have anything that's a bad change is going to cause the organism to die or become extinct. Perfect example is the woolly mammoth. So like I kind of related it before with the elephant. So the woolly mammoth, if you look at the difference between a woolly mammoth and an elephant, besides the size, is also the body hair. So woolly mammoths had body hair in order to help keep themselves warm because of the environment that they lived in. Well, they think that, as the environment changed and the ice age went away and now it became a warmer environment, well, this became not so good for the woolly mammoths. So it was a change in their environment. I'm sure the food source that they were used to also changed. A lot of people think that they were hunted by the prehistoric man. And that might be the case too, but ultimately, I don't think that was the main reason why they died. Okay, so it's important to remember that regardless if it's a good or a bad change in the DNA and mutation, it does get passed on to the offspring. Okay, remember, the only DNA that the offspring is getting is what is written in the mom's egg cell and what is written in the dad's sperm cell, and that is what gets passed on to the offspring. So if it's any other body cell mutations, those aren't going to get passed on. It has to happen in the sex cell. Okay, so that's one thing that's another thing that he saw. So he saw natural selection, that certain birds on the Galapagos Islands, if the island had a lot of fruit, he found a lot of birds that ate fruit on the island versus, another island that had like very thick seeds. Well, Think about a bird. If it's a very thick seed covering, you're probably going to need a really big beak to crack that open versus a small beak. So that's what he noticed. So he's noticed natural selection and that there were differences. There are variations on all the different islands. He also noticed this concept of overproduction. So many organisms in this world actually produce more than what they need. Perfect example, if you think of sea turtles. So if anybody's ever seen what happens with sea turtles, the sea turtle comes on the land, they lay their eggs, they cover their eggs, and then they go back out to sea. And when the eggs hatch, you know, I'm sure you've seen the video, like these little things like scampering around to go to the water. Well, a lot of times they get eaten by raccoons that are in the area. So obviously those ones that have the better traits, AKA are faster and get away from the raccoon, make their way to the sea, and those organisms have a better chance of surviving versus the ones that aren't able to get to the sea. So there are a lot of organisms in this world that one of the strategies that they use is overproduction. Fish is another example. They have thousands of babies at one time, but knowing that most will not survive. Okay. Then we have speciation, which is the creation of new species. So what happens is slowly over time as organisms start developing and changing slowly, the difference between the organisms becomes so different that they become different species. So, you know, take a look at dogs. There are many different kinds of dogs, but they're all part of the same species. They haven't really differentiated enough yet, but eventually over time they might. Perfect example would be like the wolf and the dog is another example of, I believe, a speciation. A lot of times speciation, when that happens, those two organisms aren't able to mate and actually produce an offspring. So there's a very important word here called a common ancestor. A little bit later, I'm gonna show you it's called an evolutionary tree, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the common ancestor. Okay, so here is an example of natural selection, okay? So giraffes didn't always have this super long neck. They had shorter necks. I mean, they were longer than, you know, our necks, but they were shorter than what they were then. So what happened was natural selection favored the longer necks. The giraffes that had a slightly longer neck, well, they were able to get to the tops of the trees and they were able to eat the leaves much more easier than the organisms that did not have, the giraffes that did not have the long neck. So that what happened to them? They didn't get enough food. They probably weren't able to mate as often. So slowly over time, the giraffes with the longer necks had the better traits. So what happens? A giraffe with a long neck and a giraffe with a longer neck mate with each other. And what happens? Their offspring have longer necks, and so on and so forth. One thing you got to remember about evolution is none of this happens overnight. This takes the hundreds of thousands of millions of years, small changes over a big period of time. So that neck in the giraffe could be like an inch longer than the other ones, but that inch could give that giraffe a slight edge over the other ones, allowing them to be able to survive and reproduce. Remember, the key message here is they're surviving and reproducing. So that's what you see here in this picture. So the necks were shorter initially, and then as over thousands of years, slowly the necks got longer, not because they were stretching. There was a scientist that thought that, Lamarck, he was wrong. But what happens is the giraffes with the longer necks survived and reproduced, and as that happened, their offsprings had longer necks, and then the offsprings with the longer necks were able to survive and reproduce, and so on and so forth. So it does take a long time for that to happen. Okay, so another thing that I want to go over, went too far down, is this idea of an evolutionary tree. So an evolutionary tree is going to show relationships. The oldest members are always found at the bottom of the tree. I want you to think of the tree like the trunk and then the branches with the leaves, okay? So the base of the tree is always the oldest. So just like the base of the tree of the evolutionary tree are always the oldest members. The bottom organism is going to be known as the common ancestor. So here is an evolutionary tree, okay? So right here, if you want to label this for yourself, A is the common ancestor. So if you see A here is connected to every single organism here. So that's why they're known as the common ancestor. So what happened was there were changes in the environment, there were changes wherever, there were mutations. And slowly those changes caused it to become a different species. So A became species B and became species E. So you see how it branches off? So think of a tree. So they start off in the center and then they branch off from the trunk. So same thing. They started off with that common ancestor, but then they start to branch off. So B is a branch of A and so is E. So you can see how B then branches off to C and D, and then D branches off to H and J, so on and so forth. So to kind of give you a little bit of information about this. So we call these branches. So when the branches are closer together, that would assume that they have more similar DNA. So J and H here have more similar DNA than I and F over here, okay? Now, to kind of work it backwards, J and H here have a common ancestor. Yes, their common ancestor is A, but they have a more recent common ancestor. That would be D. So H and J have a more recent common ancestor, which is D. Just like F and I have a more recent common ancestor, which is C. Now, is there a common ancestor between F and J? If you go all the way back, yes, F and J's common ancestor is B. So if you look, who is the most different? Probably G and J, G and H, G and I, and G and F. Because if you see, they're a completely different branch on the tree. So the base of the tree is always the common ancestor, and then that's how you read the information. So it's always the oldest to the youngest. So these organisms, F, I, H, J, and G, are the youngest organisms, whereas A is the oldest. Okay, so if you take a look, I believe I have all of this written out on the bottom. A is the common ancestor, F and I, H and J. Okay, now, last thing I forgot to mention, whatever is up at the top here, see how it says present? That means they're alive today. So F, I, H, J, and G are all currently alive today. Now C, D, V, A, and E are extinct. So what does that mean when something became extinct? For some reason, the traits that they had for that particular environment were not good enough, so they died out. Okay? So we're going to continue talking more about evolution in next week. But this week, I want you to spend some time on some pages that I'm going to provide to you from your Living Environment Review book. And then you'll be submitting some homework assignments through that. But please take a look at those videos that I posted. In addition, I really would like for you to when we have a Zoom session this week, if you have any questions, please, 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 please come into the Zoom session and ask questions. I'm sure a question you may have is a question somebody else has as well. Okay, so please let me know if you have any questions. Okay.